A very good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. Kate Neal there. Welcome to the last of this season's lectures, and we kept the good wine to last. At least enough. But that's what I reckon, Seán. We'll see what happens later on. Anyway, usual housekeeping is just put your phones on silent, please. Exit to the back of the hall there, up the steps, away to the left, and out the door here, away to the right. Just follow Anne there. She's a record beaver and in the event of emergency. And you'll be safe, quite safe. There's a box at the back of the hall there for any donations anybody wants to leave to us. And without further ado, I'm with Hooray, Seán.
Thanks, Hooray.
Just with Seán here tonight, and just I was sitting there and I had nothing else to do there to pass a couple of minutes, and I thought to myself, if you had to have a theme tune or a little ditty about tonight, it would go something like this. I am a jolly beggar man, and Bagnall is my name. I went away to minute, and then came back again. The begging life is grand all around the town. When a man gets tired, he can sit upon the ground. That's all I have for you. I'll have the rest of it, I'll have to fiddle it out.
Ken, as usual, thank you for your kind words of introduction. I'll think exactly what you meant about them maybe at some stage during the evening. Beggary as a mode of support. This is an exceptionally large topic, and there's a big blue folder in my bag there, and fully half, 550 pages, deals with the minutes of the Poor Inquiry from 1835, dealing specifically with beggary. So I can only give you a very cursory overview. And one of the things I'll do is I'll get out just to give a brief indication of the size of the problem, or the number of beggars and their dependents who lived by this means of support in the 1830s. It's not easy. We can look at the census in 1831 and 1841 and get a clear idea of the numbers of people and the size of the average household. There is some speculation we can look at as to the accuracy of these censuses, but they beg the question, did beggars have homes? Were they at home and available to be counted? And even if a substantial proportion of beggars were homeless, do they appear in the statistics at all? What I'm saying to you is it's very difficult to count the numbers of beggars at the time. In general, it appears from research I've done in other areas of the Poor Inquiry that about 5% of the population, parish by parish, is involved in begging. And this is estimated from a random sample of the parishes I looked at, and is based on the actual numbers of beggars reported in each area. And it does not appear to account for the dependence of beggars. I have looked at a number of the parishes where the Poor Inquiry have set out to give some idea of the actual numbers of beggars to be found locally. From this we can speculate, perhaps with some insight, about the proportion of the population who generally made their living from begging. So, and I'm saying this to you because any estimate I give you on this is subject to a wide margin of error. But whatever way we look at it, the numbers of beggars was enormous. If you take 5% of 8 million people is 400,000, and if you take, as in many cases there were, spouses and dependents, you're looking at well over 1 million people who resorted to begging either temporarily or permanently to survive. And this was an area of particular interest to the Commission of Inquiry, and they devoted, as I've said, over 500 pages of their inquiry to setting out the minutes of their findings on this one topic. And I can't give you a full summary of their findings, but I'm going to deal with it in 3 parts. Firstly, the Commissioners sat in well over 100 parishes to conduct their inquiry, and so I will set out from their minutes the format of these sittings, the agenda that they followed as far as the minutes indicated, and this will give you a clear indication of the information that the Commissioners set out to gather and how they conducted these inquiries. Secondly, I will deal with the very first 2 parishes that are reported on, because these illustrate the agenda and how it was used to structure the information gathered. It will also serve to gather in a couple of pages the orthodox answers painting the general picture of the phenomenon of beggars in the country at the time. And then thirdly, I will try to give some flavour of what it meant to be a beggar, how they survived or didn't, and how the ordinary population generally reacted to them. And we will dip into the minutes from some other parishes around the country to give a flavour of the reality of begging as a way of survival around Ireland. So the first two parishes that we're going to look at are Headford in County Galway, and Headford is right up against the Mayo border near Con. And then we look at Kilcreast. Kilcreast is just south of Loughrea in the middle of East Galway. And as I said to you, we're also going to dip into Omagh, which is the townland in which the town of Clifton is located. So we're looking at West Connemara. We're looking at Killamore, County Galway. Naas, County Kildare, we'll have a brief look at. Rathangan, County Kildare. Ballymahon in County Longford. And finally, we'll just have the very briefest look at Clonakilty in County Cork and at Ballymoney in Dunluce up on the Antrim coast. And so back to the beginning. The first parish that was looked at was the parish of Headford in Galway. And from the minutes in this parish, it appears that the format that each of these inquiry meetings followed covered the following topics. Firstly, they set out to put some fist on the numbers of beggars in the parish, whether they were increasing or decreasing and the reasons for such, and whether the wives and children of those who migrate have to beg while their husbands are away. B, the question was also asked as to whether there was any official method of relief in the area. For instance, whether there was a vestry fund or a house of industry or some sort of a mendicity institute or some such. C, the third point is they looked at where the beggars come from and why they became beggars. So this goes on to deal in some cases with the circumstances of eviction and the seasonal nature of some of the begging. Point D, there was then a section setting out some questions on the amount that these people succeeded in getting from their begging. And naturally, if you think about it, this was followed by questions about what these money was spent on. And then there was a section, which will be a little bit of fun when we get to it, dealing with what you might call the tricks of the trade, the craft of begging, and how somebody might enhance the return for their effort. So just let your imagination dwell there as we go through the rest of the lecture. And then there followed some discussion on what we might call in modern terms the lifestyle of the beggars. This is particularly interesting because it gives some insight into their cultural values and indeed the cultural values of the people among whom they begged. And then at point H, there was some discussion about the care taken by ordinary people to inquire into the character of the beggar. And this was presumably before they would hand over any money. How was it going to be spent? Was this somebody who might waste it? And then we can move down to point I. The question of giving lodgings to beggars was discussed in some detail. And there is some further insight here into the attitudes of the ordinary population to beggars. Point J. There was also a very interesting discussion on the question of just who gives to beggars, and we'll be talking more about that. And then K goes on to deal, it moves on from that, it goes on to deal with the general attitude to begging and to what people's attitude was to making some statutory provision for looking after beggars. Point L, there was some discussion on the general result and consequences for everybody, both the beggars and the population among whom they begged. And this is, were they a good influence, were they a bad influence, all these sort of questions. And then in these parishes, there was some discussion finally with some consideration of imposing a punishment for being a beggar. So that was what went on at the time. Now, the first parish we're going to look at is Headford. And Headford is located just there. It's almost on the shores of Lough Corrib, and it's just immediately south of the Mayo border. You can see there the exact intersection of the border with Lough Corrib. In fact, Headford, in more recent times, it's not very far from Cong, and it was part of the settings used for the filming of The Quiet Man with John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara. So let's have a look at Headford. Headford had a population of 3,438 persons about in 1835, and the people attending that inquiry reported that there were not more than 20 public beggars in the town. John Burke reported that 6 or 7 beggars called to his house daily. It was generally reported that poverty had been decreasing over the past 20 years, that there was a greater amount of agricultural work available and a greater number employed. They also reported that they had a good landlord locally who abated the rent in bad times. And this answer may have had something to do with the fact that the landlord in the area, Mr. R.J. Mansur St. George, Esquire of Headford Castle, himself attended the inquiry and was sitting in the audience. Some of his answers are quoted later on. Then in Kilcreast, which we'll also talk about, and Kilcreast is in East Galway, it's about there. It's immediately south of the town of Loughrea. If you can picture Loughrea in your mind, it's east of Galway town on the way towards, or Galway city, sorry, on the way towards Roscommon, and the inquiry also sat there. These had a population of 1,699 people, and the answers were somewhat different here. Here they spoke of 5 or 6 beggars being around in the summer, but no more than 2 or 3 in the winter. They spoke of not knowing the beggars, as there were so few locals who begged. The vast majority of the people who begged in that area were supposed to be strangers. And from the tone of the report here, it seems that they believed that the tenants of local good landlords never have cause to leave and beg, whereas begging was much more common among the tenants of absentee landlords. This evidence was presented in such a way that it seemed to have been a sign of shame among landlords to have tenants who needed to leave to beg. But to give some idea of the sheer numbers of travelling beggars in general in the country at the time, Mr. Darcy reported in Kilcreast that up to 120 beggars called to his house per day. Richard Gloucester in the same parish reported that from 20 to 50 called to his house, again per day. Mr. Mullins, the Catholic rector, pointed out that as soon as people are able to work, they are forced into industry as they will no longer be relieved by the people. And this is just another example of the people of the time distinguishing the deserving and the undeserving poor. Reverend Mullins also pointed out that whereas there had been some increase in the number of beggars in the area during his 7 years there, and as with Mr. Darcy and Mr. Gloucester, this priest, the Reverend Mullins, reported 20 to 50 persons per day calling to his house to beg. Where did they come from? The next question that arose in the inquiry is, where did they come from? The question follows on from the first, because there was a propensity to blame those who weren't from the locality. There was much comment in Headford about high rents and absentee landlords, and it was specifically pointed out that the majority of residents, of beggars who are resident in this parish, come from the lower end of the parish near the lake, and that would be on the shores of Lough Corrib, and that would have been away from Mr. Mansur St. George's estate. So they were blaming somebody who wasn't in the inquiry that day. And they also said, and you can see where it's located on the shore of Lough Corrib, others come from the mountains and country districts of Mayo. But not our problem, they're from the next county. There in Mayo, it was pointed out, the land is poor, the landlord is absentee, and the rents are high, and there is no manure available to improve the land. They half starve themselves and beg to meet the rent, as otherwise they would face eviction. And this is the people in Headford talking about the people in Mayo now, so I don't know how much of that you can how true it was or how it was just a comment about people who weren't there. Arising from this situation, there were reported to be about 50 families who were ashamed to beg, who are quietly supported by neighbours, particularly during the summer. It was further stated that after the spring seed time, the men go away in search of work and leave the women and children to beg until they return. And this is the time of the year when beggars are most numerous. So from late spring, from April, May until harvest time, the men are away, the crops are growing. As you know, even from the traditions of this area, last year's potatoes have run out, and that's the time when people needed to beg and when people starved most. They also reported in Headford that it was the mechanics and labourers who most often beg, and very few, if any, of the cottiers will beg. A circumstance that I have seen before was also reported here in Headford. It was reported that the old and infirm people, who are often obliged to follow a vagrant life after they had transferred their properties to their children. And incidentally, this was a topic that came up again and again through other sections of the Poor Inquiry, and basically you can start to call it, and I'm not going to be sensitive about this, the scourge of the daughter-in-law. There was a consensus though in Headford that the main cause of begging were the low prices for agricultural produce and the minute subdivision of the land. And there was a general consensus also that if work was available, there would be few, if any, beggars. They would hire for 15 shillings a year rather than beg. And this is in a labour market where the best labourers could get 30 to 40 shillings per year. To give you some idea of what they were prepared to accept as an alternative to begging. And there were similar answers to the same questions in Kilcrease parish. Beggars were generally from Mayo. Even this is much further away from the border with Mayo, but they were generally from Mayo and were generally the tenants of absentee landlords. It was stated that there were never beggars from estates where the landlord is resident or where tenants were treated with kindness. Mr. Darcy pointed out that he was the agent for the Marquess of Clanricarde and that he knew of not a single tenant or family member of a tenant from that estate who ever went out to beg. It was also stated in Kilcrease that a good many came out to beg from Loughrea. They were a bit south of Loughrea. It was a bit of a walk out, but this apparently happened. They generally succeeded, and this is the comment that was made, in begging 6 times what was needed to support them, and they sold the surplus for, if they did not, what would pay the rent of a cabin in the town or what would put clothes on them. So they begged for more than they needed, they sold their surplus, and the cash from the surplus was used to dress themselves and to pay rent. Now let us look at how successful the beggars were at supporting themselves. Starting with Headford. An able-bodied beggar could get from 1 to 2 stone of potatoes per day, and they are regularly able to beg more than they consume. And we know from other parts of the Poor Inquiry that the average diet was consisting of from 12 to 14 pounds of potatoes, just under a stone or up to a stone per person per day. So 1 to 2 stone was up to twice what any particular person needed to be able to support themselves. They may even be generally able to sell some and to put together some cash. An allegation was made here that some successful beggars would have money stitched into the linings of their clothes. But in general, they got very little meal, except for those known to have large families who got a bit more. Farmers usually gave potatoes, and it was said that they often had lots of potatoes but no money, so what else could they give? And it was pointed out that there is no coin in the realm of so low a value as to equal a handful of potatoes. That's the way it's put. Conversely, beggars always prefer money, and once they have collected sufficient potatoes, are thereafter begging for the money value of the potatoes they collect. It was stated that persons of every class have a number of dependents, and it would appear that beggars have their clients. And a shopkeeper reported that 4 beggars have made his street their walk on market day. So this is the territoriality of beggars. And they collect from all the shopkeepers on that street. But a number of people made the point that they would prefer to be giving a little to many rather than supporting a few who depended on them, because they wouldn't feel as obliged in that way. Now, what do beggars spend their money on? Where they can get cash for surplus food, then clothes, tobacco and soap are generally purchased. But they purposely do not purchase good clothes, as these would destroy their trade. In Kilcreast, the report speaks of beggars buying a little sugar or tea, and on fair days, perhaps a little whiskey. There was a story told in Headford of a local woman who considered herself so good at begging that she went all the way to Kilkenny every year to beg. Potatoes were dearer there, and her skill at begging potatoes and selling them for good prices enabled her to return home at the end of the season comparatively rich. And a further story was told of a man from the Joyce country who used the surplus from begging, amounting to £3 in a year, to stock his father's farm with sheep over 2 years. It was also reported at Kilcreast that the wives and families of cottiers often left home after their own potatoes were set, and they went into other areas to beg. Towards the end of the season, it was common for the locals in the other area to say to them, "Your own potatoes are fit for use now, you ought to go home." And generally the answer came that, "Yeah, I hope to return shortly." And let's have a look at the tricks of the trade. As you might expect, dirty clothes and a filthy appearance were described as being assumed by beggars, particularly if begging in the towns. And the comment was made that if they did not produce sores on their skin, they certainly did maintain them when they did come. They spoke in Kilcreast of a beggar having a special begging coat with up to 20 rags stitched to the sleeve to enhance the beggarly appearance, even though they have a good coat in a bag or are even wearing it beneath the begging coat. In Headford it was said that whereas beggars do not use deception, stranger beggars certainly do use deception. So beggars were described as pretending to be lame or otherwise disabled. The story was even told of a beggar seen at a fair in Tuam who had an arm tied up in a sling for the day. That evening, he had an altercation with a countryman who hit him with a stick. He was immediately two-handed, took the stick from the countryman and gave him a severe beating. A similar story was recounted in Kilcreast, where beggars who attended the fair generally resort to pretended lameness or some such. One such supposedly lame beggar had a row with a policeman and was able to give him a drubbing with his crutch. And this particular beggar, and I've no way of verifying this, it was a story told at the meeting, this particular beggar was reported to be able to give his daughter a dowry of £30 at her wedding time. And in a country where a good labouring man earned 40 to 50 shillings a year, that was an awful lot of money. This man was described as a king among beggars, and the possibility that he received tribute from other beggars was referred to. He may even have run a protection racket, and his name was given in the reports as a Mr. McGann. And reference was made to the fact that while begging within the town of Loughrea, he went barefoot, but when out of town, he was noticed to have a good pair of brogues. In the parish of Killimore, it was reported that some beggars at fairs put on bandages to pretend injury on lameness, and then repeated, or rather roared out prayers while asking alms from passers-by. These beggars were known in some areas to have a nickname as prayer rhymers. It was described that lying, forged recommendations, and other expedients were resorted to by the type of beggar described as a decayed gentleman or woman. And these would be older people. It was also mentioned that where they have deaf or dumb children, they would not normally prevent such children being put in an asylum where they might be properly looked after, but that in many cases such children were taken in the cold and the wet in order to excite pity, without much clothing on them, in order to excite pity. And there was some discussion in these reports about the lifestyle of beggars, or what might be called lifestyle. It was remarked that while many beggars led a dissolute life, this was not general. Beggars were seldom involved in outrageous or serious crimes, and it was stated in both reports, both Headford and Kilcrease, that they were never involved in assassinations. God grant us some mercy. But they were often guilty of small thefts and petty pilfering, but never really of robbery. The out-of-work agricultural labour might emigrate, but the professed beggar would never do so. Mr. St. George in Headford reported that vagrants never borrowed children to enhance begging, but he had known of the fathers of bastards to place their children in the care of vagrant nurses, so that they were going to be used and presumably they were rented out. He said that many beggars never die from starvation, but many do develop illnesses and fevers from which they eventually die, and that would be from bad living conditions and from exposure. Particularly wretched beggars could beg more than they earn as labourers, and another attendee reported that the vagrant is usually better fed than the labourer. There was an interesting good discussion going on in Headford, and I'll just say a few words about it now for a minute, between the landlord Mr. St. George and a Mr. William King. And the funny thing about this Mr. King is he's not listed in the list of those attending that particular session of the Poor Inquiry, but he is quoted in the minutes. And one can only assume that he was a man who arrived late and the secretary had left the door and gone up behind the dais and was starting to take minutes, and he slipped in without his name being listed. But he has comments to make. He makes plenty of them in the course of the hearing. And we'll come back to him in just a few minutes. The hearing goes on to deal with whether the character of the beggar is inquired into before giving. And generally, the answer seems to be that where potatoes were given, people didn't really ask questions. But if they were going to give money, they asked questions. And then there was some discussion as to whether the prevalence of private charity was prejudicial to the character of the beggar. And it was generally agreed that it's not. It was agreed that very few would beg rather than work, and there was a reference to the seasonal work and seasonal begging as being indicative of this, that they begged when there was no work, and when there was work they came home and they took the work. There was very interesting discussion in all the sessions about the question of giving lodgings to beggars. The poor cottier never refused lodging to a beggar. Other forms of relief consisted of potatoes, as we have seen, a little meal, if it could be afforded, buttermilk, and some small coin, particularly at fairs and by the better off. And you can imagine the situation at a fair, that the farmers are there and they're buying and selling cattle, and there's a whole lot of hand spitting, and there's cash paid for these cattle, and you can imagine the beggar looking in the background and he sees that man has just got paid, I'll touch him now. And this is what very much the life that went on at the fair. But there was considerable disquiet expressed at the idea of giving lodging. It causes dirt and it brings on fever. And beggars were considered often as spreading false reports and exciting rebellious feelings. They were the gossip merchants. And there was also discussion about the spread of diseases by giving lodgings to beggars. Typhus, itch, and scuffula are mentioned, and scuffula is described as being prevalent here in Headford. There was a more detailed discussion of the problems associated with giving lodgings to beggars. A cottier cannot be clean, neat and tidy, and a cottier's garden cannot be kept that way if the beggar and his family, and notice and his family, are admitted. And this is the first mention of the family of the beggar. Their habits of idleness and love of gossip, and what is called strange news, and the want of decency, where this family curl themselves up in a corner of the room. It could all cause harm to the morals and habits of the labouring classes, said Mr. St. George. Other diseases are said to be spread by beggars include children's diseases, smallpox, measles, whooping cough, and many more were particularly spread in the town by giving lodging to beggars, and these were the fears that people had. Solitary female vagrants could be troublesome and ill-conducted, and were not known generally to interfere in political subjects or anything of that nature, but they could cause other problems. One man in Clifton, just to give an idea, one man in Clifton explicitly said that if he had grown daughters, he would not give lodgings to beggars. So you can imagine the sort of fears he had in his mind. Who gives to beggars? It was reported that farmers and shopkeepers were the principal supporters of beggars. Mr. St. George reported this, and now we're getting into the discussion between St. George and King. Mr. St. George reported this, and Mr. King was quick to point out that the beggar is most often sent away by the rich. Others reported that the rich have certain known objects of charity rather than common vagrants, and that the poor give proportionately more of their income to the beggars, up to 10 times more, according to some. And the point was made by Mr. St. George that the charity of the rich is exerted more in employing more workmen than they require, than they give in alms. And this was him answering back Mr. King. Even when a beggar collects more than he requires for himself, it is never wasted, because he always sells his, or indeed her, surplus to an equally poor person who may have collected more coin and less food. And there were several comments on the tendency of the poor to support each other and even to leave themselves in want through their generosity. Mr. King had words to say, and said he believed he would be in greater want if he gave nothing away, and believed that charity never shortens the quantity. And to this, of course, Mr. St. George piped up immediately that charity caused a wasteful and irregular expenditure of what might otherwise go to add to the comforts of the labourer. It was also pointed out that beggars sometimes had some method, some intuition of calling to a house where a meal was going on, because on the basis that the household would not miss what was fed to them in those circumstances. Mr. King described giving his last piece of meal to a beggar in the hope that God would provide for him on the morrow. Payment of a small regular sum, as under the poor rate, would be objected to, whereas small donations of provisions were not felt. And at this point, Mr. St. George reported that relief is sometimes given because it is feared that the beggar might sometimes actually be suffering from hunger. It is often exhorted by importunity, and it may be the custom of the country. But Mr. King replied that he gives for the good of his soul, for the honour of God, and for the benefit of the beggar. He said that when you say no generally, they go away, except for a few sturdy beggars. And this is the whole question of people feeling a fear of a threat of violence from beggars. And there was a discussion between Mr. St. George and Mr. King at this point, with both appearing to agree that none give under threat of violence, where there does not appear to be want. Mr. St. George got the last word on this point when he said that he thought that many give to beggars out of fear of the beggar's curse. But it was acknowledged in other parts of the country that there is a class of sturdy beggar who is often relieved that he's given to out of fear of violence. So again, that problem exists not here, but it exists in other places. And the comment was made that teasing importunate beggars, importunate is an old word for threatening, beggars are not liked and get very little encouragement. And sometimes, and this was a curious thing, sometimes people have called back a beggar to whom they have already said no, simply because the beggar was polite and went away without grumbling. So there's an attitude in that. And then, of course, Mr. King said, I have known many persons who were once obliged to beg and are now industrious and doing well. To which Mr. St. George replied, I have known some instances, but not many. In another part of the Poor Inquiry, it was stated that it was generally the small farmers, the poor cottiers and the shopkeepers who gave to beggars. And the comment was made elsewhere, I think it was in Naas actually, the rich have their gatekeepers and we daren't go past them. The question of punishment, a Vagrancy Act and punishment, and there was a short discussion on whether such a provision should be made. And there was a consensus that vigorous laws against beggary and vagrancy could never be enforced while there was a chance of starvation. And it was also stated that there could never be enforcement of such prohibition unless the law made some provision for dealing with beggary. It was stated and not contradicted that serious crimes cannot be the immediate result of destitution. In other words, the poor weren't the criminals. And finally, it was stated in Headford that there was no house of industry or other provision for mendicants in that part of the country. And let's now have a look outside of the structure that I've set out. And just before we leave Kilcreast in the middle of East Galway, which was actually attended by somebody who gave his occupation as a mendicant. And this was himself as a beggar. And the commissioners, the assistant commissioners here, thought this evidence was so succinct and so moving that they recorded it in full. And I'm going to give you the full of it now because I think it's a marvellous picture. I am 73 years of age. I was able to work until 3 years ago. I was a labourer and was middling well off, for I had work almost every day. I live in town and have a cabin and half a quarter of ground from Mr. Pierce, for which he charges me no rent. My wife is blind these 2 years. I have one unmarried daughter who lives with me, and she can't earn enough to support herself. I go about among my neighbours to get a sup of milk or a lock of potatoes. I carry a bag and always get from 2 to 3 stone of potatoes at a time. I get more than another because I'm an old neighbour. I was never refused by any of them yet that I went to. Mr. Gloucester gives me 6 pence almost every week. I scrape a little manure up every year, and the neighbours till a spot of land for me. I get nothing from the rich people except from Mr. Darcy and Mr. Gloucester. I don't go far from home. I am nearly naked. I have not a tack of covering but what you see on me, and I would be ashamed to go where I am not known. I bought no clothes these last 3 years, did not wear shoe since last Christmas, and this is the first 12 months that my feet knew what it was to want shoes since they were last able to wear them. And that's Terence O'Loughlin's summation of his life. 73-year-old man, absolutely nothing. There were, of course, variations on this standard in other counties and in other provinces. Let's start by going to Omagh, as Clifton. And Clifton, as you all know, is Clifton is right out there, the very western tip of Connemara. There was a comment here on the hardship caused by the delay in payments for public works that were carried out. This is a small variation. And at this stage, the government was funding road building and bridge building. And it appears that very often certain public works were carried out, and then a parliamentary grant was required to fund the work. What was happening was the work was ordered, the work was done, and then basically Parliament had to pass an act to pay for it. And there could be a delay in that. And misery was caused by the delays in paying for the work because the contractor had no money. He couldn't pay the labourers who had come to work for him. Parliament had to vote the money, and then the money had to be sent. One interesting comment was made in Clifton in Connemara is it said there's no class of beggars here, simply because everybody is of that class. In another parish in the same part of the world, Kilcummin, we are given some idea of the economics of landholding. Captain O'Flaherty farmed 170 acres. He reported that all of his tenants paid 10 shillings per acre rent and that he employed 10 to 20 of his tenants. But he also reported that there were 70 able-bodied men residing on his farm. So there were about 50 men for whom he had no work and who had no work among themselves, and they had no work available to them outside of tilling their own piece of ground. And I think this serves to emphasise that there was a substantial labour surplus throughout rural Ireland at the time. And this is feeding into this enormous problem. And O'Flaherty went on to say that women worked regularly. They spun flax and knitted stockings, and he commented that in that part of the country, it was a bad wife who could not make up half the rent. A comment was made here that a wife could now make 2 to 3 pence per day, but could sometime before now have made up to 4 times of money. And then in true Irish fashion, of course, some other wag in the audience cropped up, and he said, "Before now is gone." In this parish, it was also commented that certain areas men were paying up to £3 an acre rent. So there in one parish you'll have an example of what was Flaherty's rent? 10 shillings per acre. Flaherty was charging in rent, but other parts of the parish, other landlords were charging up to £3 per acre. So there's an example of varied rents in a very small area. In the parish of Killamore, there was a discussion on the virtue of cleanliness, of it not costing, and of it fostering industry and good habits. And this gets us back to the whole Victorian thing about cleanliness being next to godliness. But the comment was also made here, and it gets back to the absentees again. The comment was made that if the landlord stopped home from St. James's Square and gave employment to their tenantry, we would have few, if any, vagrants. So regularly through the Poor Inquiry, we have comments on the difference between resident and absentee landlords and the effect on the farm and on the tenantry. But I want to point out one thing to you about it's just something to realise about absentee landlords, and this is something I came across in Leinster. If a landlord has 2 farms in 2 different counties, say down here he has one in Galway and one in Mayo, and of necessity he lives on one of them, then technically he's absentee in the other county. So not all absentee landlords were, if you like, actually absentee in the sense of swanning around London. So be careful about generalising on the word absentee. That's the point I want to make. Sometimes we have a way with words, and that the English of themselves don't think of when they develop this wonderful language of ours. John Corbett, a builder at Clifton, made the point that while we speak of beggars, we are not speaking of the poor. We have not come to speak of the poor yet. He is quoted of saying, he opened up a discussion, the beggars are not the poor. And then the discussion followed about the deprivation of many small cottiers and the ends they go to make their rent. And this whole discussion was feeding into the fact that the small cottiers have a modicum of respectability left, and they will starve themselves to maintain what they see as their place in society, whereas the beggars, and we've come across this before, have lost their sense of shame, and because they've lost their sense of shame, they are more effective beggars. So I'm just making the point to you, and it has been discussed around the country, the beggars may not in fact be the real poor. If you walk with me through the country, I could show you many a house where decency would not suffer you to look at the mother of the family for want of sufficient clothes. And this was made by a Mr. Joyce, who attended the hearing in Clifton. There are very few who can afford to taste the milk of their own cow. They are obliged to bring it into the market to sell, that they may have something to pay the rent. And this was another point made in Clifton. So you have the beginning of a debate there, which carries on around Ireland, about just who were the poor. And then the Archbishop of Tuam, the Church of Ireland Archbishop of Tuam, made the point, begging is a trade and charity is a duty. And by the way, one thing I came across here, the word spalpeen, and we've heard it, is recorded in the Poor Inquiry as referring to a labouring man who travels to find work and leaves his wife and children to beg while he's away. And Dr. MacHale, the Catholic Archbishop of Tuam, made the comment in a submission he made, without the remotest intention of reflecting on the motives of the individuals who have prepared some of the interrogatories, and whom I am sure are actuated by the most benevolent intentions, I cannot but feel that they have been originally suggested by hard-hearted enemies who caricatured our national misery in order to find in the exaggerated faults of its victims an apology for neglecting it. Dr. MacHale, the Catholic Archbishop of Tuam at the time, he was making the point, he was very pro-Irish, he was very anti-English, and he wasn't just anti-English, he was anti-establishment in a lot of ways, because right up to the end of his life, for instance, he was in dispute with the Catholic Archbishop of Dublin, Cardinal Paul Cullen. So Dr. MacHale was argumentative, to say the least. But he put into the record the Irish expression, Jarka dun Jarka. And it's one I hadn't come across before. And it basically translates into English as alms from alms. And he used that expression to make the point that basically it's the poor who support the poor. And just for the last couple of minutes, I want to give some flavour of how the picture in Galway, Ireland Mayo, is sometimes typical and sometimes not typical of other parts of the country. Naas provides some interesting contrast. It was reported here that there were about 250 beggars in a population of about 4,900 people, according to the census of 1831. And this indicates, again, this is getting back to our 5% of the population. It was further stated that about 100 beggars assemble every Saturday morning and collect a half a penny each from about 9 or 10 shopkeepers. So here, some people prefer to pay a regular amount on a Saturday in return for not being annoyed on a daily basis. And the remark was made here that most of the beggars in Naas appear to be from Connacht. Here also, a Mr. Lawler gave the story of some beggars who make a living of sorts by acting as matchmakers who move about the country. They carried messages for farmers' daughters to local bachelors and sought husbands for the daughters of local farmers. And it is interesting to compare that with the fear that many in Galway had about the effects on family morals of giving lodgings to beggars. And such beggars, and they were called bouthies, and there's some of these interesting old words crop up in the Poor Inquiry. Bouty was spelled B-O-U-T-H-Y, and I'm not too sure what word that is, or I wondered for a while, has that come down to us as bowsy? I simply don't know. And Mr. Lawler made the point that beggars who provide those sort of social services regularly begged up to 6 stone of potatoes per day. So they're way off the clock in terms of what they need for themselves. And this was compared with the 2 to 3 stone that a normal beggar would collect. And from other sources, as I mentioned earlier, we know that the average diet required from 12 to 14 pounds, just under a stone of potatoes per day. So these beggars were at least well fed. The comment is also made at Naas that vagrants neither waste nor exchange their surplus collections. They sell them, and they buy tea or tobacco and sometimes whiskey, but never clothes, inasmuch as good clothes would destroy their power of exciting sympathy. Vagrants seldom save anything. They spend every farthing they get as soon as possible. Now, that's contradicted in Connacht, but certainly the comments about the craft of begging and the fact that they don't spend money on clothes, that's repeated right from Headford, right across the country. And so we see some of the repeated themes from 2 very different parts of the country. And in Naas they also attempted to measure the cost of supporting beggars, and there was some debate as to whether a farmer could support another labourer, for instance, with what he gives to beggars during the year. In this debate, it was estimated that some farmers in the area gave away in straw, food and money up to £40 worth in a year. And this amount would certainly have paid for several additional staff on the farm. So you can imagine that in Naas, and in the circumstances around Naas, the locals said that they would prefer a tax for the support of poor than to carry on as they were. And 2 other pieces of information emerged at Naas. And again we have the voice of a poor man emerging. Andrew Neal, a labourer, attended in Naas. He gave his age as 85, and he said he supported himself with his horse and car. He said he would rather die than go into a workhouse if one were provided, because I would have my liberty, I could dispose of my earnings in any way I liked, and I could divide them with friend or relation as I had a liking for. And there's a great statement of independence from an 85-year-old man. Keep your workhouse. I'll go out and I'll earn my money, and I'll have my friends, and I'll live the way I want to. And the report quotes an estimate of the amount given by the shopkeepers of Naas to the poor. And the total annual amount estimated from the shopkeepers of Naas to the poor was estimated at £273.15 a year. And the good burghers of Naas were estimating that any regular tax would certainly cost them a lot less than that. So they were in favour of building some sort of a workhouse and paying a reasonable amount of tax to support the workhouse. And in Rathangan, in County Kildare, a slightly different figure emerges. You had an amount bitten by farmers in the locality annually estimated at over £206, and the amount given by shopkeepers, and it's a much smaller town, don't forget, at £117. So there was an estimate made of Rathangan that that local parish contributed £323 annually in alms to support the poor. And it's not that the shopkeepers in Rathangan were less generous and Naas, it's simply that there were few of them. And as you can imagine, with that amount of charity flowing out of the area every year, they were certainly in favour of setting up some sort of an official edifice to look after the poor and paying some reasonable amount of tax to support it. There were 6 pages of minutes taken in Ballymahan in County Longford. Now we're down here now, as you can see, we're down to the 3rd last. We're here. Firstly, in Ballymahan, there was a lot of discussion as to the number of beggars in the area. They reported that there were up to 250 beggars, but that many who attended did not want to admit that the problem was that large in their area. However, there was some discussion about the decline in the linden industry in Ballymahan. And Mr. John, this is why I wanted to refer to this. Mr. Johnson, a large farmer, gave a description of the decline as follows. I have rented for many years the tolls of this town. That means he took a franchise on them. The Great Yarn Fair used to take place in May the 7th. At the fair of 1821, I received £20 as cranage for weighing yarn at 1 penny per score of £20. So there was obviously a big trade in yarn, and that would be wool. There may have been linen involved as well. So there was obviously a big trade in Ballymahon in Longford in 1821. And he went on to say, that sum has declined since, until last May, and the last May would have been May 1834, just before he gave his evidence, when I did not receive 5 shillings. The same quantity of yarn that formerly sold for 18 and 20 pence now sells for 9 or 10 pence per pound on a hugely declined volume. So there was both a substantial drop in the volume of yarn and a halving the price of linen yarn, as it was in this case. And that's an insight into the decline that took place in Ireland after the Napoleonic Wars were over, and there was a collapse in demand for cloth, for uniforms and all the rest of it arising out of that. And there's a great description of the way one man's trade declined. And the report from Ballymahon ends with the admission from one who gave evidence on the last day. Several of those attending spoke of their reluctance and even their abhorrence of living in a house of industry. A house of industry was the terminology at the time for a workhouse. On the day after the submissions had been completed, Michael Rourke came to the Assistant Commissioner and he said, the labourers are beginning to be afraid that they said too much against the poor houses at the hearing yesterday. This was a postscript. They do not think of it as bad now as they thought then. But 'tis one thing a man will say in a crowd when his pride is up, and another when he returns and sees the poverty at home. Munster. Much the same arguments were made in Clonakilty as we have seen in other locations visited, particularly about the numbers of beggars in the area. But in Clonakilty there was also some discussion about the preference of people to give charity rather than have a regular tax. And there it was said the farmers all object to anything like a tax. They say, we do not feel or miss what we give at present, and besides it's a more convenient way of giving it. It would be easier for a farmer to give £2 worth of potatoes than to pay £1 in tax at a certain fixed period. They were asked if £1 regularly would go further in supporting the poor, would you prefer it? And they replied, it would not go further, or so far a great deal of it would be paid away in building the houses of industry, in giving salaries to officers and fees to lawyers, as in England. The word Bockoff, what would Bockoff be? I came across a report, this word in the report for Clonakilty, and it was a book, I think it's actually pronounced, it might be pronounced Bucko. B-O-C-C-O-U-G-H, and Bucko is a word that we all have an idea what it means. But in 1835 in Clonakilty, it was used to describe the beggars who use deceptive means for the purpose of exciting compassion, or who are or were guilty of various knavish tricks with this view. And I think it probably is Bucko, and that gives you a modern connotation for it. And finally, I want to look at the very last place, Ballymoney in Upper Dunluce, which is up on the north coast of Antrim. And here it was said, vagabonds strolled through the country and to the seashore for the sake of amusement, the love of a lazy life, and the hope of imposing on benevolent strangers. It sounds almost bucolic and is totally at odds with the descriptions from elsewhere about the preference of all, including those forced to beg, to earn their keep in any other way rather than beg for it. But in Ballymoney they spoke of the decrease in numbers begging since the local mendicity, and the reduction spoken of was from 50 to 60 wandering beggars
down to about 12. The remaining beggars were described as infirm through age and now in the mendicity. It was stated here that when female servants are driven to beg, they invariably become prostitutes and never return to service. They also stated that the greater number of the beggars in the neighbourhood, and here we are again, blame the other guy, that the greater number of beggars in the neighbourhood come from Derry and Donegal, and that the area of Mahara is known for sending out beggars. They reported that a man could gather from 6 pence to a shilling per day, which was much more than he needed to support himself, and no money is given to beggars at the doors of the churches. A difference noted here is that beggars were reported to be harsh with children, and that the children with them are frequently hired or borrowed for the purpose of begging. And the comment here was made that beggars are generally long-lived. And here it was said that the quantity given yearly by individuals was about £3 worth. And the shopkeepers pointed out that the mendicity was a relief to them, as before it they were paying out about £3 per year each. Here farmers were frequently compelled to buy potatoes at the end of the season, where, if they had not given away so much during the year, they would have had enough to last until the new crop was dug. And this gets back to Manser St George's comment in Headford. Such farmers would prefer, in Ballymoney they're saying such farmers would prefer a tax of a fixed annual sum to this situation, and in this parish they have even gone as far as to take a council's opinion as to whether they should set up a mendicity themselves. But it was found that they had no legal or statutory power to do so, and the idea was dropped. I'm going to finish in a minute because I see Sheila outside walking around in great agitation. And in this part of the world, in Ballymooney, the opinion was shared that the most deserving objects of charity would be glad to go into a house of industry. And that's total contrast to everything we've heard all around the country. And there was some idea given of what was meant by the local Mendicity Institute. 10 cottages had been rented by the Mendicity Association, and they were still renting them. But they had been relet as the association found that the poor preferred to live in their own cabins. It was stated that the cottages could easily be filled with destitute poor if it was deemed desirable to have a house of industry. So there you have it, the life of the beggar in the 1830s. Thank you. Questions, comments? Nothing really changes. No. Yeah, I like that one myself.
Is there any statistics
Yes.
on beggars in this day and age?
I don't know. But I can tell you there's nothing like the numbers that were then, because half the meetings, Father Peter McVery, the unemployment statistics give me no indication of how many beggars there actually are. Yeah?
So just looking at the timescale, the majority of the lower classes would have been speaking Irish.
Yeah.
Were many submissions given in Irish? In other words,
No.
did we have the establishment talking about the other lot? Really? Was
Well,
that the main submissions?
What was happening was the commission was quite carefully appointed. First of all the minutes are in English.
Yeah.
But the commission was quite careful in that they had one Englishman and one native Irishman as the assistant commissioners at each hearing. Presumably on the basis that therefore both the English and the Irish point of view would be represented in the note-taking. And we can only assume that what's recorded is a fair record of what was actually said. And I think, when you see somebody like Terence O'Loughlin quoted in full, and he's actually, it's in inverted commas the whole way, so it purports to be a verbatim.
But he was able to speak English.
But he was able to speak English, yes, yeah.
Now the second question, and I'm pulling in Lady Gregory and her writings, where she looks at the spalpeen
Yeah,
and the itinerants.
yeah.
Did the itinerants come up much, or the spalpeens come up much?
No, you raise a very good point, because there is no classification among travelling beggars as to whether they were itinerants travelling by culture or whether they were the poor just forced to beg. That distinction isn't there.
Yeah. Lady Gregory talks a lot about the itinerants and the spalpeens getting housing with a contract that you either brought the news, and she wrote a book called Spreading the News,
Yeah.
or you gave some folklore stories, particularly some of the long folklore stories.
Yeah.
And if you had that contract with the guy in the cabin, you were guaranteed a good feed and a night in the shed.
Right.
And Lady Gregory particularly talks about that. She's
Yeah.
in the 1880s.
Yeah, and like one of the things that just strikes me, you see, and it's one of the areas I'm interested in, because ask the question, you know, between 1845 and 1849, there are estimates of around about 2 million people, 1 million dying and 1 million emigrating, and some estimates now put the emigration at 1.2 and the dying at 800. Who died? Was it these beggars, or was it the small cottagers struggling to maintain appearances? You know, and that's a question that has never been answered, because it leads on to a further question then. If any of these people survived, what did they become after 1850? Were they the nucleus of our travelling families, or I simply don't know. I'm just throwing them out as questions, discussions, whatever you like. But you know, I think it's fairly accepted now that it was the beggars and the small cottagers who died by and large, who starved and died. And you know, and the question therefore is that if any of the beggars survived, what became their culture after 1850? And I don't know.
Well, the only contrast I've made between Lady Gregory is that she taught herself Gaelic.
Yeah.
And she spoke to the locals through Irish, and
Yeah.
she wrote through Irish.
Yeah. And
Whereas
that's
the ones-
Galway.
Yeah.
And that would have been far from
Kiltartan.
Kilcrease.
Her
Yeah.
2 books on Kiltartan weighted
Yeah.
that quite considerably.
Yeah.
So it is a contrast with the investigation itself,
Yes.
that they were not getting source material from those who spoke Irish.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, look, that's a fair
That's
point.
the way it was.
It's all recorded in English, and that's the way it was.
That's the way it
And you raise a very, very valid point. Yeah.
Okay.
And the 1935 Irish language, it's true that the British offered schools a grant if they didn't speak Irish.
I'm not aware of that.
I think it happened in 1835. They said they weren't reading the capital start and in the Irish language. That was very important for them, that the British had said. But I saw something on the school in Leinster. You get grant for your school, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you speak Irish, you won't get a grant. That was something went on in 35.
Yeah, no, the Commission for Education was set up, I think, in 1828, 1829,
Yeah.
and an awful lot of the head schools then started to enrol under
Yeah.
the national school system from then on. I've looked at a few of them. I looked at the one for Tallaght, for instance, and I haven't seen that, but what I have seen, I think the Commission were actually quite disappointed with what happened, because they wanted schools to be non-sectarian. The education committee that applied in every area, they wanted to see a mixture of religions on the application.
Yeah.
One of the things that surprised me, for instance, with the Tallaght application was that John Latan, who lived in what's now the Priory in Tallaght Castle at the time,
Yeah.
he and his son were both on the committee that applied to bring one of the Tallaght schools into the education system, and he gave his religion as Catholic. And I had always him in my mind as being Church of Ireland. But the point is that the Commission for Education, I don't know about their policy on English Irish. I know that there was an awful lot of opting to learn English because of emigration and because people perceived English as being more useful to them. But certainly the Commission was disappointed that the churches became involved and divided education and made it a confessional thing.
I can't answer you on the question of Irish. I've seen no evidence.
I thought that they want to quote the counter heroes anyway, they have to get into the other culture.
Well, you see, the other
Same
thing,
Russia and Germany to Poland.
yeah, the colonial service was growing. And for instance, the amount of Irishmen in the civil service in India
Yes, well, this is it.
in the early to mid 19th century, and they got those jobs because they were fluent in English.
Yeah. Well, that's right,
Yeah.
That thing, anything strange. So you meet people, first thing to say, anything strange in town today.
Yeah, yeah.
That would have come from them people that was, they brought strange news. Or
They
something.
just strange news, and it would be
Yeah.
gossip, it would be mysterious stories, and there'd be stories that nobody would ever find out the
That-
truth about,
yeah.
and all of that, you know?
I still
And you
pronounce
could be
that,
right.
Yeah,
You could be
yeah,
right.
down
Yeah,
at home now.
yeah. Anyone else?
One French travel writer in the 18th century said that every country has its beggars, no more, no less, except for Ireland, which he was travelling in at the time, and which he said was a nation of beggars. So
Well-
with figures like you're talking about, it's very easy to see why the French writer
Said that.
would have had such a perception of life and lifestyle in Ireland.
But wasn't it interesting on that point, Ken, the comment in Clifton, that basically the man said, we don't have a class of beggars here, sure, everybody's a beggar.
Exactly. Thanks very much, Seán. Much appreciated. We kept the best one for last. Slán na bhaile, folks. Safe home to all of you. Switch back on your mobile phones, and we hope to see all of you again in fine fettle here. So good luck. God bless. Safe journey. Slán na bhaile.
Thanks very much.